Chapter 5, Section 3, The Battles of Lexington and Concord. Colonial militias were storing weapons in Concord, Massachusetts. The British, upon hearing of this, were determined to take the weapons from the colonists. Paul Revere and William Dawes were chosen to alert colonial militias if the British were going to march to Concord. Revere and Dawes made their famous midnight ride to alert the colonists on April 18, 1775. The battles of Lexington and Concord would take place the very next day, on April 19, 1775. Colonists learned from the French and Indian War that the British marched in bright red coats and marched in lines. Colonists used hit-and-run tactics to fight the British. The colonists would fire at the British and then hide behind trees. The British won the Battle of Lexington and continued marching toward Concord, where they were met by a stronger militia who turned the British back toward Boston. Colonists had lined the path back to Boston and ambushed the British soldiers while they marched. On May 10, 1775, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured Fort Ticonderoga from the British in New York. Allen and Benedict Arnold took the heavy artillery from Fort Ticonderoga. They brought the heavy artillery, like cannons, from Fort Ticonderoga to surround Boston and the British. From the Battle of Bunker Hill to the formation of the Colonial Army. The Massachusetts militia began fortifying the hills surrounding Boston, preparing for a battle. Colonel William Prescott was in charge of the Massachusetts militia, while General Thomas Gage was in charge of the British Army. On June 17, 1775, the British attacked Breed's Hill. The British would win the battle, but they suffered many casualties. This proved to be a moral victory for the colonists. As a result of the battle, American forces became better organized and gained support of all 13 colonies. The African American population in the colonies fought for both sides, though Americans were slower to enlist free blacks in the Continental Army. The British recruited slaves to fight for the British and to disrupt the American economy, which was largely based on cash crops and free labor. Moving toward independence. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775. Congress issued the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, who ultimately turned down American efforts for peace. The Americans would use foreign loans to fund their army, the Continental Army, and they appointed George Washington as head of the Continental Army, in case the Olive Branch Petition was rejected. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Thomas Paine published his pamphlet called Common Sense in January of 1776. Common Sense encouraged American colonists to think about independence through two major points. The first point was that monarchy was always a bad form of government, and the second was that the time was right for Americans to declare independence from Britain. King George III, the King of England, then declared the colonies in a state of rebellion. Declaring independence. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee from Virginia made the motion for independence in the Continental Congress. John Adams seconded the motion. The Congress organized a committee to write the Declaration of Independence. The committee consisted of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. The committee chose Thomas Jefferson to write the first draft. The theme of the Declaration of Independence was that a government that no longer served the people can be changed. On July 2, 1776, the Congress voted for independence, and on July 4, 1776, Congress ratified the Declaration. Articles of Confederation. In 1777, Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was a weak national government that had no national executive position like a president or prime minister and had no court system. Taxes could only be levied under the Articles of Confederation if all states agreed. The Articles of Confederation was more like an alliance of independent states. George Washington and his victorious Patchwork Army. The Revolutionary War was a war with two very different armies. The British were organized, well-trained, well-equipped. They were a professional army, while the Americans were were patchwork militias, poorly trained and ill-equipped. The armies also had two very different strategies. The American Continental Army wanted to survive and drag out the war, tire out the British, not win a decisive victory, but to avoid a decisive loss. They hoped the British would grow tired of fighting and that British citizens would grow tired of paying for the war. The British were looking for a decisive or crushing victory to end the war quickly. British evacuate Boston. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had dragged cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. Henry Knox placed those cannons on the hills surrounding Boston. The Americans then bombarded Boston from March 1st to March 17th, 1776, until the British evacuated Boston. The War in the North, Manhattan, Trenton, and Valley Forge. The British left Boston and made New York City their war headquarters. General William Howe landed in New York City with 32,000 troops, including 8,000 German mercenaries. When British reinforcements landed, George Washington retreated to Pennsylvania by crossing the Delaware River. Washington would use unconventional tactics like attacking, then retreating. Washington also attacked on a holiday when people were sleeping, when he attacked Trenton, New Jersey, and won the Battle of Trenton on Christmas in 1776. Washington then retreated after his victory before attacking and defeating the British a few days later in Princeton, New Jersey, to control southern New Jersey. The British planned to meet in Saratoga, New York, in May of 1777. General John Burgoyne marched to Saratoga, but was abandoned by the other generals who were supposed to meet there to cut off New York from the other colonies. Burgoyne's travel took forever, which would lead to his defeat. Americans Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold surrounded Burgoyne and forced him to surrender and negotiate. The battles of Saratoga, as these would be called, proved to Europeans that Americans could win the war. George Washington was able to organize a blockade of Philadelphia to force the British out of Philadelphia, which the British had taken in September of 1777. Washington's army then camped at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania for the winter of 1777 and 1778. During this time, Baron von Steuben began to train the American troops. The Marquis de Lafayette encouraged French involvement in the war. By 1778, the British chose to move the war to the south. British felt more loyalists lived in the south and would offer Britain assistance. The British were also closer to their colonies in the West Indies and would attempt to cut off southern colonies from the middle and northern colonies. This also gave the British a chance to attack on the frontiers. Importance of France and Spain. France and Spain wanted to embarrass England and wanted North American trade access. The French and Spanish had made so many concessions after the French and Indian War, and they wanted some of their concessions back from Britain. Early on, France and Spain supported the Americans with money and supplies, but were hesitant to declare war because they couldn't suffer another defeat to the British. Eventually, both countries made full declarations of war. Spain moved up the Mississippi River to capture British forts on the frontier and attacked from the southwest. The Iroquois and the British. The British and Native Americans kept their alliance, and the Native Americans tried to cut off food supplies to the Continental Army. Loyalists formed their own militias to fight or join the British Army. Vicious attacks were made by both Loyalists and Patriots in the South as groups acted on old grudges. Many Loyalists fled to England or Canada after the war. Women also played a big role in helping the Continental Army. They raised over $300,000 for General George Washington. Women made new clothes and uniforms for the soldiers, and they took care of homes and farms while the men were away at the war. Some women followed their husbands to treat soldiers. Some women also fought in the war. The War in the South, from Charleston to Yorktown. After the war moved to the South, the British captured the port cities of Savannah, Georgia in 1778 and Charleston, South Carolina in 1780. After a few crushing defeats, Nathanael Greene was put in charge of the Americans' Southern campaign. Greene was known for being resilient and using hit-and-run tactics. Greene received help from other generals like Francis Marion, who had also perfected hit-and-run tactics. In January of 1781, the Americans won the Battle of Cowpens and took the South Carolina countryside. The Americans forced British General Cornwallis to march to Virginia in May of 1781. Cornwallis chose to camp at Yorktown in Virginia. In September of 1781, a French fleet arrived and set up a blockade of Yorktown and cut off British supplies. Washington then attacked Cornwallis at Yorktown for 2 weeks until Cornwallis surrendered. Cornwallis was in charge of the largest British force of about 8,000 troops. This battle essentially ended the war. The Treaty of Paris. Even though the British controlled the port cities of New York, Charleston, and Savannah, the British had grown tired of the war. John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams were chosen to go to Paris to negotiate peace with the British. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the war when it was signed on September 3, 1783. The United States was a free and sovereign nation. Please pause your recording here to answer the 3 review questions.